The New York City Police Department is the largest and one of the oldest municipal police departments in the United States, with approximately 36,000 officers and 19,000 civilian employees. The department was established in 1845 and today is responsible for policing a city of approximately 8.5 million people. Vic Ferrari spent 25 years of his distinguished career as a member of the NYPD and knows all about the inner workings of major police departments, and since he's retired, he's now transitioned into giving you the inside look at what goes on at America's largest municipal police department through his writings of his books. He pulls back the curtain to give you an authentic look at what really goes on at one of the largest police departments in all of America. Through short stories and anecdotes, he gives you a first-hand account of a police officer's perspective. And I was privileged enough for Ferrari to join me this week to tell me more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. If you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm super excited to learn all about your time with the New York Police Department and your time in law enforcement. Great to see you this afternoon, and thank you so very much for being here.
Well, it's great to be on your show, and I really appreciate you having me on. And you know, again, I told you off air, it's people like you that make my life easier, putting me on your forums, and I appreciate it.
Well, it's my job to make you look good now. Isn't that right?
I sure hope so. I'm going to need all the help I can get.
Well, I'll do my best, okay? So, Vic, tell me about the more than 2 decades that you spent at the New York Police Department and how that impacted your life.
When I was a little boy growing up in New York City, I grew up in the Bronx. I always wanted to be a police officer. Since I was the age of 5. It's all I ever wanted to do in life. My parents wanted me to go to college. I would have none of it. I like to tell the story. When I was 10 years old, I used to sneak into the post office and steal FBI wanted posters off the wall and go around the neighborhood and look for bad guys. By 20 years old, I went in, I took the exam. By 21, I was in the police academy. I had a 20-year wonderful career. I worked in a bunch of different units. 15 out of my 20 years, I was in plainclothes. I worked in anti-crime units, like going after pickpockets and robberies in progress. I worked in a DUI unit. I worked in the narcotics division. And my last 10 years, I was a detective in the NYPD's auto crime division. So anything with chop shops and stolen cars and exporting stolen vehicles out of the country and a lot of organized crime cases. And after I retired from the NYPD, I got into writing, and I've written a series of behind-the-scenes books about the New York City Police Department.
Fabulous. So let's dive into those books. I know that you've written 2 now about that experience. So tell me about the books, what they're all about, and the process about writing them.
Well, the process, the funny thing is, so I retired, and at the bequest of friends and family, they said, you know, you got all these wild stories and colorful characters. You should really write some books. And I said, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a writing background. Who's going to want to really hear my stories? But I said, you know what? If I'm going to do it, the two things I don't want to do, I don't want to get anybody divorced. And I'm not a sour grapes kind of guy where I'm going to point people out or get too close to the sun. So what I do in my books is I change the dates, the time periods, the ranks. But these events actually did happen. I just don't want to point anybody out, if you know what I mean. So the process for me is, all my books are just a collection of short stories. There's no beginning, middle, end. You could pick up one of my books and thumb through it and see a chapter. So for argument's sake, there'll be a chapter in my book, NYPD Through the Looking Glass, Stories from Inside America's Largest Police Department. That was my first book. And one of my favorite chapters in this book is practical jokes and what goes on inside the station house and how cops are constantly playing practical jokes on each other and setting each other up, just to break the monotony of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, with all of your experience within the department, what do you think people need to know about police officers that they may have a different perception of, that you want to sort of change the narrative? What do you think people should know about cops that they don't necessarily know now?
Cops have a sense of humor. So if you're in the street, like over your shoulder, I see that you're running that loop of a bunch of cops standing outside, and I think that's actually cool. And if you want, I could explain exactly what they're doing, because I know how the department works. But if you go up to a cop in the street in New York or any police department, you ask for directions or you have a problem, more than likely you're going to get that stoic, robotic, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. You really can't get a feel of their personality. And the reality is, cops do have personalities, and a lot of them have a good sense of humor, but you're not going to get that unless you really get to know them. Because if you reverse roles and think of it as if you were standing out in the street and you're wearing a uniform and everybody's got their eyes on you, children stare at you, people stare at you, and people are coming up to you constantly with their problems, right? Nobody calls the police when they're having a party, invite them over for a barbecue. People call the police when they're having a dispute with their neighbor, they're arguing with their wife, they're the victim of a crime. They have problems. So what happens is, a lot of times with police officers, they're very close to the vest, like poker players. They're not really going to show you their personality until they really get to know you or get a feel for you. But the reality is, most cops do have a good sense of humor and are good people.
Yeah, absolutely. So you wanted to explain the loop over my shoulder. So tell me, what cops usually do when they get together in a loop like this?
Okay, so just from what I can see, more than likely that's Manhattan, just by the traffic and the amount of people going by. It's not the Bronx, maybe it's Brooklyn, but I think that's Manhattan. So that's what's called a detail. A detail is a demonstration, a parade, something where they bring cops from different areas and they place them in one location for crowd control or security. So you can see there's a sergeant there, right? You can see the chevrons on his shoulder, and he's got the gold band across his hat. So on a detail, usually what happens is you get one sergeant, and that sergeant is assigned 8 cops. And they follow him around like ducklings. As you can see, they're not going too far from him. More than likely, they have a street corner right there, and they're told, you've got this corner, be out there for security during this period of time. I also can see in front of them, you have the metal barriers. So probably at some point, they're going to take those barriers and either block traffic at a certain time when a parade is passing, or it might even be the president of the United States is in town. And what'll happen is, when that presidential motorcade goes by, each corner has those barricades where they block off the street, and then you'll have the motorcycle cops come. They'll also block off the street. But as you can see, and I can also tell by the cops talking to that sergeant, they're young. I can tell they're rookie cops, probably under 5 years on the job, just by their appearance. The sergeant looks like a new supervisor just by his age, and he just kind of looks a little green by the way he's looking around. And everybody's wearing, I can also tell you that those cops are young because they're wearing their hats. 99% of the time, NYPD cops, if you got more than 5 years on, even though you're supposed to wear your hat when you're in uniform, everybody's got their hat off, and they either hook it onto their belt or they throw it in the radio car until the supervisor goes, hey, put your hat on. What else can I tell by them? I would think, yeah, the president might be in town because you have an ambulance there. Usually when the president's in town, you have ambulances all over the place in staging areas. But yeah, that looks like a detail in Manhattan.
You're fabulous. That's a lot of detail from a Zoom video background. So I appreciate the thorough analysis on it. It's most appreciated.
No problem, my friend.
And Vic, I'm curious to. Actually, I've been waiting all afternoon to ask you this question. You know, when we look at the cops today, especially in America, they're asked to do a lot of mental health work that they're not necessarily trained for or may not always be the greatest person to handle those mental health situations. So when we look at mental health situations and the role cops play, tell me, what do you think needs to happen to assist more cops when they go out on these mental health calls?
Sure. So it's a dirty little secret. Nobody wants to hear it, but it boils down to manpower. Okay. Depending on the department. So when you're a cop in a precinct or a small town, say for argument's sake in your town, I don't know how large it is, say in your town, it's a 50-person police department and each shift turns out 5 or 8, 10 police officers, right? And they're answering a variety of calls. You only have a certain amount of time on a call. You just do. And that's why a lot of times people get upset with the police because they make snap decisions. But the reality is you can't spend the day trying to mediate a situation because the calls are backing up. And sometimes you have emergency calls backing up and you have to leave. So with mental health issues, a lot of times, and I agree with you, those tend to take a lot of time. You'd rather, if you have a person, and usually it'll boil down to a relative, will call up and say, listen, my son, he's very combative. He's not taking his meds, or he's taking drugs with his meds. He's threatened me. He needs help. The reality is you want to talk this person, sweet talk them into the radio car, into the ambulance, and bring them to the hospital to be evaluated or a mental health facility, right? If you have time to do this, great. The reality is you don't, because the calls are stacking up, right? So if I'm at some location trying to sweet talk somebody, okay, come on, and the person doesn't want to go, and you're bargaining with this person, going back and forth. Now you got a robbery in progress going on. Now you have a bank robbery showing up. Now you have a domestic violence where a woman's getting beat up by her ex-husband. It boils down to manpower and how quickly you can get that job done. It definitely boils down to manpower. You can only train the police to do so many different things. And you know, it's funny, like, what I love when I hear they say, well, we have to train the police more. My God, the amount of training there is nowadays to be a police officer. And there's so many more different tools to use than when I first started. Like when I first started, you got a gun, a nightstick, and mace. Now you have a taser. Now they have Velcro restraints when someone to restrain somebody. Now they have plexiglass shields. They have non-lethal, those beanbag things that certain departments use. And there's tons of training with that. But it boils down to the end of the day. It jumps off of trying to get that person out of their residence or in the street to a mental health facility as safely and as non-confrontational as possible. But you just don't have the time.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, Vic, I also wanted to ask you the role of the police play when it comes to making societal progress, because, you know, I view police as a critical part of sort of the community ecosystem and creating pathways of progress forward. So how do you look at the role of police when it comes to making societal progress as well?
Well, the thing is, the police, I know this is going to sound strange to people, but at the end of the day, the police don't really have a lot of power. Yes, they can arrest you if you're doing something wrong. Yes, they can give you a summons or tell you to leave a location. They can give you a lawful order. But the police don't set policy. Local governments, the federal government, they set policy, and the police have to follow those rules. You know, it's when in New York City Police Department, when I was a cop, yes, we enforced drunk driving rules, right? And we arrested people for drunk driving. But when I was a cop in the 80s, there was so much going on with crime and the crack epidemic. Realistically, and nobody wants to hear this, we didn't have time for DUIs. You know, on a busy night in a busy precinct, they're stacking 30 calls. You're rushing to the next call. If we pulled over a drunk driver, most of the time we'd either take their keys from them, call them a cab, as long as they weren't in an accident. You know what I mean? Nowadays, you can't do that. Nowadays, the emphasis is we have to go after drunk drivers. And that comes from above. And now you see that, like, drunk driving in most police departments, that's a top priority. After I retired from the NYPD, I was a police officer in Florida for a short period of time, and I can't begin to tell you the amount of training and emphasis they put on drunk driving, which in New York, yes, we enforced the law when it happened, but we weren't really instructed that that was a top priority. So, I mean, the police really do what they're told as far as the community is concerned. You know what I mean? Like, community leaders will go to a meeting and they'll say, we want more cops in this schoolyard at night because these kids are in here, and sometimes we hear gunshots or they're playing the radio loud. And then the captains tell the police, and then the cops are told that's a priority. So I guess the point I'm trying to make with this long answer is things come from above.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Vic, I don't need to tell you that part of community policing is creating and forming authentic relationships. So tell me the importance of creating relationships and building trust. How important is that in your role as a police officer, in your opinion?
Oh, definitely, because the community is going to tell you where the problems are. You know, the cops aren't mind readers. So it's the super of a building that's going to call up and tell the local cops that in apartment 3B, there's a couple of guys in there selling drugs on the weekends. Or a neighbor will call the police and say, listen, in the back, the neighbor next door to me in their garage, they're chopping up stolen cars. It's huge, the intelligence that local law enforcement gets from the community. The problem with the NYPD with that is we went through a huge crime wave in the 90s, right? And then the Giuliani administration came in and basically took the handcuffs off the police and told us to make arrests and everything else. What wound up happening is the NYPD never knew when to take its foot off the gas. And to a degree, the people downtown and you know, the people at One Police Plaza, they got addicted to the statistics that the cops were producing. But when crime is down, the statistics are going to go down. But they kept insisting they wanted more statistics. They wanted more summonses. They wanted more arrests. I like to give the analogy of, God forbid you had cancer and you went for chemotherapy, right? And then the doctor says after a couple of months, you don't have cancer anymore. You're in remission. You wouldn't keep going for chemotherapy, right? You'd stop. And what would happen was, the department would insist with the summonses and the crackdowns on things. And now you're going to piss the community off because you've solved the problem, but you're still buzzing around constantly. You're still giving out summonses at an inordinate rate. And it tends to, you'll get blowback from the community because they're like, well, wait, we're the ones that have been calling you all this time, and now you're giving us a hard time. So there's definitely a fine line with the community that you got to know when to take your foot off the gas.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vic, since you spend so much time in America's largest police department, I'm curious to also ask you about the inner workings of a police department. And what do you think people need to know? What happens when they actually call the police? Because working for the NYPD, I'm sure you have a unique perspective on the workings of a police department. So I'm wondering if you could share those with me this afternoon.
Sure, I could tell you how the NYPD works. So the New York City Police Department is the largest police department in the world. At any given time, there's between 35 and 40,000 members. There's 77 police stations in the New York City area scattered across the 5 boroughs. In New York City, there's about 9 million people. So say for argument's sake, we'll pick a precinct in the Bronx, right? There's 12 police stations in the Bronx. Each police station has between 100 and 200 cops in it. All right. Each shift turns out probably between, depending on manpower, 20 to 30 cops, right? And in New York, each radio car has 2 police officers per car. You have a desk officer that's going to man the desk in the precinct. You're going to have a sergeant outside in a police car with a driver. He's the patrol supervisor. And you'll probably have at least 1 or 2 lieutenants working during that shift. All the calls come through 911 down at One Police Plaza. In a busy precinct, you and your partner can handle anywhere between 20 and 40 calls. I mean, oftentimes we didn't get a meal hour. We were lucky if we could grab a sandwich, eat in the car while we were filling out a report, and we were on to the next call. You can't plan your life around the NYPD. You think you're going out after work, you're going to take your girlfriend out, or you want to get a couple hours sleep. Boom, you get an arrest, and that's it. You're tied up with this person now for the next 6 to 8, 10 hours. And if you've got a prisoner and you think you're taking them to court and they get sick, now you have to go to the hospital with them, and now you have to safeguard a prisoner at the hospital until they're medically cleared. Then you go down to court. It's the amount of hours and tour changes and stuff in police work. It's a very rough job. It's a young person's game.
For sure. And to that point, Vic, I'm curious to get your definition of how you define effective community policing, because, policing always starts in the community. I don't need to tell you that, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on your definition of effective community policing.
Yeah, in the early 90s, the NYPD started community policing. I think it was under the Clinton administration, and they allocated funds for the NYPD to do community policing. And in my opinion, the NYPD got it wrong, because when they said, okay, they called it CPOP, Community Policing on Patrol. So community policing with the NYPD was each precinct had anywhere between 10 and 30 cops that were assigned a foot post. And every day you would have a certain post, and you were supposed to meet with community leaders and talk to shopkeepers. You'd have your ear to the ground because you had a foot post. And with this new assignment, cops got steady days off, steady hours. But what wound up happening is, and I know I'm speaking out of school here, but every lazy cop in the NYPD gravitated to CPOP. You got I could speak from my precinct. You had the laziest cops in the world said, "Oh, great. I don't have to answer calls. I'm on foot all day. I can hide in a barber shop. I don't have to really make arrests. I'm buddying up with community leaders." And it kind of fell apart. I know they've kind of reinvented it, and what they should have done is taken cops that had good evaluations, that were active. You know what I mean? Not the dead wood in the precinct, and giving them those assignments. And what wound up happening is it just kind of fell apart, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's all about rebuilding an infrastructure when it comes to community policing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to get to the root of the problem, and you want to have a solid relationship with the community, you should really put your best and brightest cops in that assignment. Not the guy that sleeps in the couch of the precinct and answers maybe 5 calls a day, and he's never anywhere to be found. You want the cops that are making arrests, that are good with people, you know what I mean, that have good evaluations, that will get to the root of the problem and listen to people's concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vic, as you know, the current mayor of New York, Eric Adams, used to have a career as a police officer. So when you look at that, do you think it's an asset for the police department that the mayor used to be sort of a cop on the front lines of the fight that they're enduring every day. How much of a asset do you think it is that Mayor Adams has a background in policing?
In theory, I think you're right. I think someone that knows the department inside and out, right? Someone, not an outsider. Like the NYPD for a while was grabbing people. Lee Brown came from Houston. Bill Bratton, although he was a good police commissioner, he came from Boston. We would get a lot of times outside people, and there's good and there's bad, because you get someone that thinks outside the box and brings some of the things that they learned in other places that worked for them and brought it into New York. And like with Bratton, it worked. Other guys, it didn't work because they were kind of so hung up on where they were from. Adams is an interesting guy. He was kind of a politician while he was a cop. He was always quoted in the newspaper. He always was big in a lot of the NYPD groups. I don't know the man personally. He was a Brooklyn guy. I was a Bronx guy. I know he's very big at marketing himself. I just don't know how did he get his hands dirty when he was a cop? You know what I mean? Was he out there making arrests? Did he get good evaluations? I don't know the guy. I know the woman that he hired to be police commissioner. She's very highly thought of in the law enforcement community. So I applaud him there, because I think she's going to be a really good police commissioner. But as far as Adams is concerned, I just don't know. The jury's out with him with me.
Well, yeah, everything comes in time, right?
Right, exactly. It's going to play out one way or the other.
Yeah, and Vic, I'm also interested to ask you about, when we turn on the news today, and I'm not asking you to get political if you don't want to, but I'm fascinated to get your answer on the defund police movement and sort of giving police the resources they need to be successful in the job, because it's a very stressful job. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on what comes to mind when you hear the defund the police people versus investing more resources into policing as well.
Well, I think the whole defund the police movement was created to demoralize and weaken local police departments. I think there's people in the federal government that have their own agenda, and I think they want to federalize and just get rid of local law enforcement and have it on a federal level, which in my opinion, I don't think that would be good. I mean, if you defund the police, I mean, who are you going to call when you have a problem? Ghostbusters? I mean, it's just a ridiculous concept, and a lot of the people that were screaming for that during election time this last cycle, a couple of weeks ago, you didn't hear them saying that around election time. You know what I mean? It sounded good a couple of years ago, but in reality, when you have major cities like New York and Philadelphia that are just out of control with crime, I mean, you need more resources, not less.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Mike, I'm also curious to ask you about the gun problem in America, because, it seems to be a uniquely American problem. You can't turn on the news without hearing about another mass shooting, it seems, in America. So I ask you point blank, do you think America has a gun problem, and what do you think we should do about it?
I think the United States has a mental health problem. I think, most of these people that do these crazy, terrible things, right? No sane person would do this, right? Can we agree on that? A sane person isn't going to go into a shopping mall with a handgun or whatever kind of gun and harm people, right? That wouldn't come to a decent person's mind, a sound person's mind. I really wonder how, and I mean, you hear about these people that had all sorts of problems beforehand, and I really wonder how many of them are on mental health drugs. I really do, and there should really be a study on that, because, and I really don't know anything about mental health drugs. I've never been on mental health drugs. But I mean, you see some of these people in their photos, they look medicated, so I don't think it's a gun problem as much as I do think it's a mental health issue.
And to that point, when we talk about mental health versus strengthening gun laws, I'm curious, where do you think politicians can be most helpful in this regard?
You know, it's funny. I've never wanted to run for elective office. I've never, even as a cop, like I just kind of stayed in my lane. I really wish I had an answer for you, but that pendulum swings back and forth. You know what I mean? As far as sometimes these terrible things happen and you get these politicians that want to take guns from everybody. And then at the same time, you see these ridiculous laws where, they make it so difficult for someone that's never had an issue, someone who's got a squeaky clean record. Certain states like New York, it's next to impossible to get a pistol permit. I mean, it is. It's next to impossible to get one. And I mean, you own a business, you've never been in trouble in your life, you don't have a criminal record, you have no mental health issues, and they make it next to impossible to get your hands on a gun. But then you've got these 16, 17-year-olds running around, with criminal records who've gotten their hands on guns through straw purchases, and they're harming people. I mean, I wish I had an answer for you, but I really don't.
Well, your answer, I'm sure, will evolve over time, but I'm also curious to ask you about January 6th and just the overall impact it had on policing all across America, because, whether your police department was big or small, cops all across America had a reaction to January 6th. And I'm curious to get yours and what you thought of the whole incident from a police perspective and how it's really changed the outlook on the profession.
January 6th, it was a black eye for the country, right? I mean, outside people in Canada or something, they're like, what the hell is going on in the United States? Like a bunch of drunken fools descended on the Capitol and carried on like a bunch of clowns for several hours. It's embarrassing as an American citizen. I'm embarrassed by it. But at the same time, I mean, I got to tell you, I worked in riots in New York in the 90s that went on for days. And they were burning police cars, looting. I mean, that makes January 6th look like a picnic. So I definitely think it was politicized, but at the same time, it was definitely a black eye for this country. And I think that a lot of those people that were carrying on and did those things were morons. But at the same time, I've seen worse.
And to that point, I'm curious about, we always hear about the thin blue line as police officers. So tell me about the importance of maintaining camaraderie and really a community of support for police officers. How important do you think that is as well?
Different places have different. So like I said, with the New York City Police Department, there was a lot of camaraderie. It was a different time when I got hired. I got hired in the 80s. When you got to an NYPD precinct, the old timers, when I got hired, you had a lot of the guys left over from the Vietnam era that did tours in Vietnam, and then they came back and then they became cops. They wouldn't talk to you. Like I write in my books, when you're a rookie cop, the old timers barely acknowledge you. They want to make sure you're not a big mouth, a know-it-all, a crybaby. So you'll just get yes and no answers. And who treats you worse in an NYPD precinct when you're a rookie cop is the guys that got hired 6 months or a year before you. They carry on like older brothers that, mock you and, because they know 15 minutes more of information than you do. But after a while, after a year or so, you figure it out. The guys warm up to you. They invite you out for a beer. And there is camaraderie and, barbecues and, going out after work for a cocktail. There definitely is. It was a little different when I was a cop in Florida for a short period of time. But the society had changed in 20-something years. You had it's the video game generation and play dates, and now they're becoming adults and they have a totally different way of looking at things than the people that I grew up with that became police officers. But there definitely is a camaraderie.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And Vic, I asked you earlier about mental health situations for cops to respond to, but I'm also curious to ask you about how important it is that we give cops the resources from a mental health perspective. So if they see something on the job that they need to sort of process through, they have those appropriate resources. So tell me about the importance of giving cops the mental health resources that they need to make sure that they're in the correct state of mind to do the job.
Yeah, so there's a lot of disconnect, right? So a police officer goes like I gave you that scenario earlier. A woman calls up and says her teenage son, who's got issues, he's not taking his meds, right? And now the police officer is trying to sweet talk this kid into an ambulance and bring him to a mental health facility. Well, like in New York, I don't know how it is now, but I remember back in the day to get somebody evaluated, it was a big deal. And sometimes the hospitals wouldn't take them and you had to take them to another borough. So there was a lot of disconnect what to do with this person. You know what I mean? That fell on the mental health profession. So you'd bring them, say for argument's sake, you'd bring them to a hospital in the Bronx and they'd say, "No, we're full. We can't see him." Like, well, what am I going to do with this guy? You know, I can't hold on to him forever. I can't bring him home. Well, take him to this hospital. So the mental health profession's got to step up too and meet the police halfway with these things and these scenarios, because you remove the person from the situation where he was violent or, you know, unpredictable or a danger to himself and others, but there's got to be a place to take them to with people there ready to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vic, I'm also curious to ask you about your proudest moment as a police officer and how you want your personal and professional legacy to be remembered.
I guess my proudest moment, I was promoted to detective when I had 10 years in. And unlike my police academy graduation where my parents were there too, getting promoted to detective, I was an adult now. I wasn't a 21-year-old naive kid not knowing what was going on. I'd say getting promoted to detective, my parents were there and it was an enjoyable experience for me. I just want to be known as a guy that, you know, I lived my dream. I had a wonderful career. I'd like to think I made New York a safer and better place. And I'm as much as I enjoyed my NYPD career, I'm also glad to be retired. And now I get to live vicariously through myself, writing a series of books about my former profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vic, tell me, if people want to get their hands on the books you've written or get connected with you personally, what's the best way they can do that?
Sure. So all my books are on Amazon. If you go to the Amazon book section and just type in my name, Vic Ferrari, like the car, my my book library will pop up. All my books are paperback. They're $10. They make great stocking stuffers for Christmas, and they're $2.99 ebook download. And if you want to get a hold of me, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Vic Ferrari 50.
Fantastic. Well, Vic, I really want to thank you for your commitment to public service and law enforcement and for the good work that you do to promote the good parts of the profession and for engaging in conversation with me this afternoon. It's most appreciated.
Well, thank you too. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.